Hello, and thank you for listening to the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this week joining me is Chris Kresser. Chris is one of the leading experts in functional medicine, and he's actually my mentor in the space and has taught me pretty much everything I know about functional medicine. And we dig into this episode all about how he got to where he is and his new book, Unconventional Medicine, talking about why and what functional medicine is, how it can be used, and why we need it now more than ever to kind of insert into the current healthcare model to change things from the ground up. It's a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot from Chris, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot in this episode as well. So tune in, and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Chris, thanks for being on the show, my man.
Anthony, pleasure to be with you.
So you're usually known as a very calm and cool and collected guy, but I've heard you get pretty fired up recently. So I figured I'd let you have the stage and vent it out a little bit.
All right. I'm curious where you heard this.
Well, I mean, just hearing you in some interviews and stuff, it seems like you're a little frustrated with the whole system and everything that's been going on with healthcare. I mean, that you've probably seen over your career. I mean, I've seen the same thing and I've been pretty pissed off about it too. So yeah, I just wanted to chat about that a little bit.
Yeah, my wife laughs when people say how mellow I am. Because I think she gets to see the quiet intensity, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, it should get everybody fired up, really. I mean, it's a existential threat to humanity, chronic disease now. It's 1 in 2 Americans are affected by it. 1 in 4 have multiple chronic diseases. Our kids are expected to live shorter lifespans than we are as their parents for the first time in history. Things are really going in the wrong direction. Yeah. And it's interesting because it's like the proverbial frog in the boiling water. You know, the changes have happened relatively quickly on an evolutionary time scale, but not so quickly that they appear to us as dire as a problem like, climate change or something that's really like in our faces. So yeah, we need to do something about it in a hurry, but nothing is really happening.
Right, and so I think that a lot of the problems now is that there's a kind of this chasm between what people understand as conventional medicine and things like functional medicine, which you're doing a very good job at. I think that you have a very succinct way to define this. Can you just, if people aren't clear on what functional medicine is, just go over that real quick?
Yeah, so functional medicine is about addressing the root cause of disease. Whereas conventional medicine is really more about managing disease after it has already occurred and suppressing symptoms with drugs and surgery. So that's the problem. I mean, we're just trying to put Band-Aids on these chronic diseases and it's not working. With functional medicine, we're trying to prevent and reverse the diseases entirely. And that's our only hope of dealing with chronic disease.
Right. So I think that there's some confusion in this space where people think it's not effective because there's words that people maybe think as not credible, like holistic or like botanicals instead of medicine or prescriptions or alternative care. And so there's a lot of things that come with that where people think like, well, why wouldn't my doctor know this if it's so clear to you guys? I mean, this is a lot of the pushback that I got even in San Francisco where people are super open to things.
Yeah. Well, the easiest way to answer that is that it's a totally different paradigm, and that's not the way they were trained in medicine. And like any other paradigm shift, it takes time. So our medical model evolved to deal with acute problems like infections. Back in 1900, the top 3 causes of death were all acute infections: typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia. Other reasons that people went to the doctor were for acute problems like broken bone or a gallbladder attack. And that's the context in which our medical model evolved. And it works really well for that. If you get hit by a car and you break your leg, you want to go to the hospital. If you have a gallbladder attack, you want to go to the hospital. I'm really grateful for some of the achievements of allopathic medicine. We're starting to be able to do some crazy stuff like reattach limbs and, restore sight to the blind, and that's amazing. And we still need it, and we will continue to need that. But it doesn't really address chronic disease, which, as I mentioned, is the biggest problem we face. And so doctors are very well trained in this acute model of care, and they're experts in that, and they're doing a fantastic job. But the reason they don't know about functional medicine or this root cause based approach is very simple. They weren't trained in it.
Right. And so, was there a point where, obviously, you have some amazing stats in your most recent book, Unconventional Medicine. Like you said before, 1 in 2 people have chronic disease, 1 in 4 have multiple chronic diseases. 91% of prescriptions are for chronic disease. Chronic disease is responsible for 7 out of 10 deaths in the U.S.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a reason why that's happened, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But the model of what we need to manage health, I think, has just shifted. And I don't think people have realized that paradigm shift, where things now we're just not well equipped as a system from, I'd say, a payment standpoint or provider standpoint.
Not at all. Think of the way a hospital is set up. It's the ideal. It's a great delivery system. Well, we could even argue with that, but it's a adequate or sufficient delivery system for dealing with acute challenges, right? So if someone gets hit by a car or is shot or has a appendicitis or gets something stuck in their eye, they go to the hospital, they get checked in, the on-call doctor comes or ER doc comes and helps them to deal with that problem, and then it's fixed up and they go home. So it's pretty straightforward. It's one problem, usually one doctor, maybe another doctor or two, that if it's requires a specialist, and then it's resolved and they go and the patient goes home. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's really kind of the way our medical model was set up. But imagine someone who has 3 different chronic diseases. They've got Hashimoto's, they've got irritable bowel syndrome, and they've got maybe early stage MS. That sort of one problem, one doctor, one treatment model is simply not going to work in that situation. That person is complex. They have multiple conditions. They're going to require multiple doctors in our system because we have different doctor for every different body part. And those diseases are again, in our system, they're going to last for a lifetime. So the management of that patient is going to go on for the rest of their life, and it's going to be a much different picture than that simple, straightforward approach. So we not only need a new medical paradigm that's better equipped to deal with chronic disease, we need a new way of delivering that care.
Right. And even if we did have that, I think that, you also have more stats on, for instance, diabetes and like the cost that would take and the burden on our healthcare system if things kept going the way that they're going.
Yeah, it's $14,000 a year to treat a patient with type 2 diabetes. And even if we're generous and say, let's say they don't get diagnosed until age 40, which, nowadays there are kids, they're 8 years old that are being diagnosed with diabetes. So it could happen a lot sooner than that. But let's say it's age 40. And then let's say because of our amazing ability to keep people alive, even with these kinds of chronic diseases, they live another 40 years. So that's over $500,000 to treat that single patient throughout their lifetime. So you don't have to be a math genius to figure out that that's just it's not plausible. It's not going to work at all. Our system is already strapped financially, and with that kind of expenditure, 100 million people now have prediabetes or diabetes, and we know it takes only 5 years for the person with prediabetes to progress to full-fledged diabetes. that's it. That's game over for our healthcare system, and potentially game over for the United States of America as it exists as an entity right now.
100 million people at minimum, probably 500K for the, if I wanted to calculate that in a calculator, I don't think I would have enough.
No, you don't have. There's not enough zeros.
Yeah,
for sure. No, so. That's why, when we started, I said this is an existential threat, because it actually is not just about our individual health, which is important. It's literally about the survival of our society and our government and our way of life.
Yeah, and so this is diabetes. That was just one of these.
That's one disease.
Yeah. That's
yeah.
One out of, like you said, 7 out of 10 of deaths in the U.S. are from chronic diseases, which are generally preventable. I think another stat you have was that 85% of chronic disease is not genetic. That means that lifestyle driven.
Absolutely, and that's a common misconception. Back when we first sequenced the human genome, there was so much enthusiasm and excitement about how we were going to solve chronic disease, but it didn't really turn out that way. We know now that most of our risk of chronic disease comes not from our genes, but from the diet and lifestyle and behavior choices that we make on a day-to-day basis. Now, certainly our genes can kind of determine which chronic disease we're likely to develop. So if you take 10 people and you expose them to the same poor diet, poor sleep, lack of physical activity, chronic stress, maybe 1 or 2, 3, 4 of those people are going to get diabetes and become obese or overweight, and then eventually develop cardiovascular disease. You might have a couple people that develop, or 3 people develop autoimmune disease. You might have, other people develop gastrointestinal issues or hypothyroidism. So that's, the genes make a contribution, of course, but they're not. Without those environmental influences, those diseases wouldn't be developing in the first place.
Right. And I think that you have a really good illustration with your training about it's kind of concentric circles of health and how conventional medicine versus functional medicine or more integrated model approaches health. Can you just briefly explain that?
Yeah. So if you imagine a series of concentric circles, in the middle, the core is the relationship between these environmental factors and our genome and epigenome. Epigenome refers to the expression of our genes, which we know is very important. It's not just our genes, but it's how our genes express in real time. And that gene expression is actually driven by diet, lifestyle, and behavior. So, what we eat and how much sleep we get and how much stress we're exposed to and what kind of environment we live in, like, air quality, water quality, all the things that are non-genetic that impact our health. And that influences the expression of our genes. And our genes pretty much run the show. So how our genes express will then lead to what I call pathologies or what I call mechanisms, or we can also call them pathologies. So these are dysfunctions, basically. They're alterations in the normal function of the body. So that could include the insulin resistance, cells becoming resistant to insulin, or it could include overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, or it could include production of inflammatory cytokines, inflammation. So these things aren't, they're things gone awry in the body. So that's the next circle out. Then the next circle from there are diseases and syndromes. So this is what happens when you have these pathologies or mechanisms. They eventually lead to diseases or syndromes. So insulin resistance eventually leads to high blood sugar and diabetes. Or bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine eventually leads to what we call irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, or inflammation. The production of inflammatory cytokines could lead to any number of chronic diseases. And then the last circle out, ring in the circle, is signs and symptoms. So symptoms are, of course, the subjective experience of a disease, or everything that came before in those concentric circles. And then signs are the objective, measurable aspects. So there could be like, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, or, something that the doctor can visibly observe. And so in the conventional model, they work from the outside in. So you go to the doctor, you say, I have, you sit down and they test your blood sugar and they say, or your blood pressure, and they say, oh, your blood pressure is high. So we're going to give you a drug to reduce that. But what's that really doing in this model? That's starting from the furthest out ring, the symptoms, and it's giving a drug to reduce that symptom. In functional medicine, we start from the outside in, and we or from the inside out. So we might do the same test to determine the signs and symptoms. We might run the same blood pressure test, but once we see that it's high, we will go to the middle of the circle and we will say, what are the diet, lifestyle, and behavioral factors that are altering gene expression in a way that is leading to, high blood pressure and everything else that this patient is experiencing. And then we will address those things because we recognize that that is the core of the problem. And we lower the blood pressure the same amount or more typically than the drug would do it, but we do it in a way that corrects the problem and prevents the patient from having to take an unnecessary drug for the rest of his or her life. So it's a totally different approach.
And not only that, usually those things at the core are spewing off in more than one direction. And so you have, let's say you don't just have a gut problem, you also have skin problems, you have mood problems, and you're depressed. And so treating, one of these silos generally, from what I've seen, can reduce symptoms all across the board. Whereas, with going the other way in, you get a medication. Another ridiculous stat in your book is that all of the top 10 prescriptions in the US are lifelong prescriptions. I did not know that. It's crazy.
Yeah. So, it's side effects, but instead of being negative, they're positive.
Right.
Like you said, you treat someone's gut because they have GI issues and their skin problem clears up and they're able to focus way more at work and they sleep better. That's the kind of side effects I'm interested in.
Right. And so in that concentric circle for people who are terrified now of chronic disease and not wanting to be a statistic, what are some of the biggest things that you've seen make a huge, if you were to prioritize top 3, 4, 5 things?
Yeah, I mean, I already did when I created the 14-4 program, which is my sort of, I thought about, okay, what are the 4 things that can make the biggest impact for the most people? What are the 4 things that most people need to change in order to turn around their health? And those were diet, physical activity, sleep, and stress management. I mean, if everybody had those 4 things dialed in, we would not have a chronic disease epidemic at the level that we do now. It doesn't mean we'd be, everyone would be 100% healthy, but there's no way we would be in the position we're in now. So, diet means eating nutrient-dense, anti-inflammatory whole foods diet rather than the nutrient-poor, energy-dense, inflammatory, processed and refined diet that we have today. And physical activity means...
Can we actually just pause on the nutrition one for a second? A lot of times a lot of people listening to this show are maybe just getting into something like a ketogenic diet for the first time, and that's the first thing that they're doing to dig into health. And I feel like sometimes when I interact with people who are doing that and trying to make good change, I feel like I have to go back to like 2008, 2009 when paleo was just becoming a thing and ancestral dieting was just becoming a thing, and people were really figuring out that it's not about if it fits your macros type of plan, which the ketogenic diet is. Right. It's just an energy system and not a health plan, in my opinion, and doesn't necessarily promote health. It can be a useful tool, but only on a foundation of proper nutrition. Can you just briefly touch on why it's important to eat real food?
Yeah, so it really boils down to nutrient density. That's one of the most important things. So, we need about 40 micronutrients to function properly. These are vitamins and minerals and trace nutrients. And if we don't have enough of those, nothing will work right, period. And so when you're thinking about food, you want to be thinking about how can I maximize the nutrient density of every bite of food that I put into my mouth. And when you look at the standard Western diet, or even certain versions of, keto diet or low carb diets, or certainly low fat diets, the problem is they're often foods that are very dense in energy or calories, but they're very low in nutrients. And so you end up getting a ton of calories and not very many nutrients. Whereas what we call the ancestral diet, which is just refers to the foods that human beings have eaten for the vast majority of our evolutionary history. We're talking about meat and fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants. Certainly not if you're doing keto, but that's the kind of general template. All of those foods are very nutrient dense. They're high in all of these vitamins and minerals that we need. They tend to be relatively low in calories compared to something like pizza or alcohol or highly sugar processed and refined foods. They tend to be pretty high in fiber, which is not a nutrient that we need, but it's a nutrient that our gut flora need. And I'm sure most people listening have heard of the importance of our maintaining healthy gut microbiota. And they, when we eat these foods that are nutrient dense and have fiber and are relatively low in calories, we naturally feel satiated. So we meet our nutrient needs, but we tend not to become overweight, and we're not eating anything that is known to cause inflammation or to disrupt the gut microbiome. So, it's pretty simple, actually. It's just following the template of foods that human beings have eaten up until about 100 years ago. So for 66,000 generations or 2 million years, we ate a certain way. And then that really changed when the Industrial Revolution occurred. And so we just have to get back to what's natural for us.
I mean, one of the things that I like to do is point out to people when you talk about micronutrient density is that if you put it on a sliding scale from most nutrient dense to least nutrient dense, even if you throw out potential inflammation or anything like that, you would want to prioritize the things that are higher in micronutrients. And so then you would be just choosing by default this framework. Mm-hmm. And so it just automatically lumps things together for you.
That's why I like to start with nutrient density, because it really makes the biggest, everything else falls into place when you frame it that way. And yes, because if you look at like a food like, pizza or bread, there's very, very little nutrient density. And yes, it's not good for you for a number of other reasons. The flour can feed harmful bacteria in your gut. It has gluten, which we know that a lot of people can be sensitive to. And, it's potentially inflammatory for both of those reasons. But really, even if that wasn't the case, you still wouldn't want to eat it. At least not very often, because it's just kind of empty food.
Yeah, you have an opportunity cost when you eat something that doesn't have nutrients, because then you're eating you're not eating something that does have nutrients.
Absolutely.
So on that sliding scale, where would you place kind of groups of foods from highest to bottom end of what you would eat, for example?
Organ meats are at the top of the list in terms of nutrient density. That's often a surprise to people because most of us these days don't grow up eating liver or heart or other organ meats. Most of our grandparents did, and many people around the world still do. But those foods have fallen out of favor. But if you look at the nutrient density in terms of essential vitamins and minerals, organ meats and shellfish are, ounce for ounce more nutrient dense than any other foods. And I've even said before that I think it would be better to be, predominantly a vegetarian that only eats organ meats and shellfish than someone who eats a paleo diet and just eats lean muscle meat with no organ meats or shellfish. That's how nutrient dense they are. Number two is actually herbs and spices. So this is kind of one of those hacks that you can do to make your diet more nutrient dense, is just to incorporate more herbs and spices in your cooking. Because again, ounce for ounce, they're super, super nutrient dense. Dark chocolate that's some good news, because a lot of people are bummed that I just mentioned organ meats being
Right.
at the top of the list.
Spices aren't too sexy either.
Spices, yeah, I mean, that goes either way. A lot of people do like herbs and spices, but they, there's a learning curve in terms of how to actually cook with them, and keeping them on hand and stuff. I mean, the good news about that is they can totally change a meal. You can have some staples like some meat and some vegetables, and you could eat the same staple foods throughout the week, but you could totally change the flavor profile and the experience of the meal just by changing the spices. That's
exactly what I do as well. Just basically have meat and vegetables, and then become really good at being able to season them and use spices and herbs and things like this. And it's
a game changer. I mean, and it's a great thing for nutrient density. But yeah, dark chocolate, that's the really happy bonus for a lot of people when they learn that. So I'm not talking about Nestle milk chocolate. I'm talking about dark chocolate. 75-80% or above is very rich in nutrients, and provided that you're eating it in moderation and you're eating it doesn't have a lot of added sugar, then that's a fantastic food to incorporate. And then you get into vegetables. Certainly are high on that list. They're next. And whole fruits definitely have some beneficial nutrients. Nuts and seeds, particularly when they're soaked and either dried or sprouted before you eat them, because that unlocks the nutrient value more than just eating them raw, or if they're roasted too. And then some, certain starches, although they're not nearly as nutrient dense as the foods we already mentioned. I forgot muscle. Muscle meats are in there too. They're up around, above vegetables in many nutrients, but they're kind of up in that same area. And then starch is not generally super nutrient dense, but they can be high in certain nutrients, like potassium, for example, or some of the fibers that your gut bacteria need, especially with like potatoes that have been cooked and cooled. So if you base your diet around those foods, you will, without any specific effort, you'll get lots of nutrients, you'll get good fiber, and you won't have super calorie and energy dense foods that are depleted in nutrients.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that, like myself, you're a pretty simple guy when it comes to this stuff. And like I said, just eat a lot of meat and vegetables and organ meat tossed in.
And shellfish, yeah.
What types of shellfish?
Oysters and clams and mussels are the most nutrient dense. I mean, oysters are pretty remarkable, especially when you look at like their copper and zinc levels. We're talking about orders of magnitude higher than anything else. Like, you only need one serving of oysters a week to meet your copper needs for the entire week. So
what's one serving?
Like 3 ounce serving, and they don't need to be raw oysters. They can be like Whole Foods has the smoked oysters in olive oil. Yeah. You could do that. They don't need to be raw. And I should point that out with organ meats too. We're not talking about huge amounts. We're talking about one or 2 3-ounce servings of beef liver, maybe mixed with ground beef or however you want to do it. That satisfies the nutrient requirements for the whole, that you're trying to get from them for the whole week.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be every single meal, and I think that's some misconception that people don't realize, that your body can store a lot of these things.
And you probably don't want to do that, right? Because they're so high in some nutrients like iron that you can actually cause iron overload by overdoing it with the liver, and I've seen that with people in my practice.
Yeah, I was just chatting with Chris Masterjohn, and he said that vitamin B12 can be stored in your body up to 30 years.
Yeah,
that was a new fact to me.
Yeah, it's amazing because it's a water-soluble vitamin. It's not a fat-soluble vitamin. So it's kind of unexpected.
All right, let's move on to movement.
So movement, is, if we look through this ancestral lens, which I think is so helpful because it tells us what's typical for humanity, we see that our hunter-gatherer ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers did a combination of kind of easy, gentle movement like walking and higher intensity movement, which for them was like hunting and chasing prey. And a little, they didn't have chairs, so they weren't sitting in chairs like we are, but of course they sat and rested. So that was their breakdown of movement. They walked, it varied, but you could say on average, hunter-gatherers typically walk around 10,000 steps a day, often more, like the Tsimane in Bolivia, who were recently studied, walk 17,000 steps a day, so that's about 8 miles. But then that walking is punctuated by periods of more intense physical activity. So if we were to mimic that in our own daily lives, it would mean sitting a lot less than we're doing. So standing and walking, trying to stand for about half the day, trying to walk for, around 10,000 steps a day. But then it would also mean exercising. Most guidelines suggest around 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity activity, and or doing higher intensity activity. So, and you mix and match. You could do some moderate intensity activity, some higher intensity activity, and then that occurs against the background of walking, standing, and maybe other low intensity activities like gardening or, cycling or even chores and housework counts. So it's just a question of becoming more active overall and less sedentary, and not just going to the gym 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah. People think that generally working out and moving is just for aesthetic reasons. And they think like maybe they're lean enough or they have no weight to lose or gain. But the thing is, like you were talking about all this nutrient density, I think of movement as essentially getting nutrients to tissues and taking away waste products from tissues. And if you're not doing that, your cells are basically just going to sit there and not have any in or out, which is not good.
That's right.
And so you need blood flow, you need movement, you need your lymph system to be pumping, you need your muscles to be squeezing, your joint surfaces to be lubricated. All these things are required for these nutrients to get in and the waste products to get out. And the food is way less impactful if you're not doing these things, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And it's so far beyond just, aesthetics and getting your beach body. I mean, especially when you look at like Alzheimer's disease, the one lever that will have the biggest impact on reducing the risk of Alzheimer's, even if you're genetically at risk, is exercise more than anything else.
More than sugar consumption?
As far as I've seen, it reduces the risk by over 50%, regular exercise. So we're talking about game-changing effects in terms of lifespan and quality of life and disease prevention. I mean, exercise has got to be at the top, right up there with diet. And I think physical activity is better than just saying exercise, because studies have shown that even if somebody goes to the gym, 3 times a week and gets the recommended amount of physical activity, they go to the gym for 45 minutes a week, they get a pretty good hard workout, and they do that 3 times a week. Okay, they're meeting the government recommended guidelines for physical activity, for exercise. But studies have shown that if that person is sitting on their butt for the rest of the week, they're driving to work, and then they're getting to work, and they're sitting in a chair at the office all day, every day, they're still going to be at significantly increased risk of disease, even with getting the adequate amount of exercise.
So you're an incredibly busy guy. How do you get it in? Because I know that's a big complaint that I always hear is I don't have time.
Yeah, so it's really about setting up my environment and making sure that it supports adequate amounts of activity. So, we were chatting before we started. I ride my bike to. I have a couple different offices, and I ride my bike to both of them, unless it's pouring rain. Sometimes I even do when it's pouring rain, depending on what the day looks like. And I live at the top of a very steep hill, so I get a good blood flow on the way back home. In particular, in one of my offices, I have a treadmill desk, so I actually walk, about half the time while I'm working.
What work do you do when you do that? Because I tried that and I just could not focus.
I
You
know.
train or what?
I wrote my first book doing it. So I tracked it. I walked over 2,000 miles in the process of writing my first book. But I know people who have said the same thing. They're just not able to manage the typing. And so the way to do it then is anytime you take a call or have a meeting, you hop on the treadmill. Dan Party, that's how he likes to do it.
So I often am on conference calls and I start like not like groaning, but I'm in like usually different like really weird positions or like on the floor moving around. You're like, what are you doing?
Yeah. So then I have I have a WeWork office too, and I can't have a treadmill there because it's too loud. And so I have an under the desk elliptical. So it's like a little pedal, small pedal thing. You get them on Amazon. They're like $300. And so even when I'm sitting, I'm pedaling that elliptical. And I was talking to Dan Party about it, and he was saying how the research suggests that that's even more beneficial for cognitive function than walking, than the treadmill desk. So even when I'm working in the office, I'm moving. I have standing desks in both locations too. So if I don't feel like walking or I need to just stand and focus, I can do that. So I'm switching back and forth between walking, standing, sitting, and then I'm using the under desk elliptical. But even micro movements can be really important. So I have something called a motion board and a motion stool. So the motion board, when I'm standing at the standing desk, I stand on this board and it has like a little half circle under it, so that when you stand on the board, you have to constantly be doing these micro movements, to balance the board. Otherwise you'll fall off or it will just, clunk down on one side. And then I have a stool that has that too. At the very bottom of the stool is, instead of having like wheels or 3 legs, it's got just a half kind of circle, like a globe. And so when I'm on the stool, I have to always constantly be moving my body to balance it. And so there are studies that have shown that just doing those kinds of micro movements throughout the day can add up to a pretty significant caloric expenditure. And then I also, on top of that, depending on the day and where I am, my WeWork office is just a few blocks from the YMCA. So I go and swim at lunch time, or I might lift some weights. I also, in my home office, I have some straps that I hang from the door so I can do some body weight exercises. I have push-up bars to do push-ups. I also have some kettlebells, so I'll occasionally do some kettlebell training, and I'll intersperse that throughout the day. So even if I don't have time for like a dedicated hour for exercise, I'll step away from what I'm doing, and I can do some push-ups, I can do some pull-ups, I can do some kettlebell exercises. So I don't buy the I don't have enough time excuse at all because what I just said doesn't really require any extra time, and it actually increases my productivity. So I get more done in less time anyways.
Yeah, I never have any type of daily fatigue or focus loss whenever I keep moving. And one of the things that you said too that I want to touch on is just that you're not just at a standing desk. It's not just going from a seated position to a standing position. You said sitting, you said standing, you said this, all these different things, and just staying in motion is better than being stagnant in any one position. So having a standing desk and standing there isn't the solution.
That's important. I know you know this, but just for your listeners, the studies have actually shown that standing it can be just as harmful as sitting.
Yes, you go from a flexed low back position to a overextended low back position, and so for musculoskeletal pain, you see the same amount of incidence, and you have the same thing, no blood flow, and that's the biggest thing. So
altering your position, and I mean, there's so many great solutions on the market now. Like even if your boss is not cool with you getting a completely new setup, you can usually get something you put on top of your desk. And where there's a will, there's a way. There's so many different ways to keep moving. Even if the only thing you do is put the elliptical that I mentioned under your desk, which no one could even really see, right, while you're pedaling, that's still going to be a huge improvement over just sitting the entire day. And you can just taking. There's always a risk of making this too complicated or making the mistake of thinking you have to do it all or else you're not going to get any benefit. Because studies have shown that even just taking a 2-minute standing break every hour can significantly mitigate the harmful effects of sitting.
Yep, no excuses. But don't try to do all of that at once, probably. It's probably not good.
Right. Yeah.
So what about sleep and stress?
Oh man, sleep is. I'm glad to see so much attention to it recently because it really, I think, has emerged as, it's starting to get the attention that it really deserves. I mean, most people who study obesity and weight and body fat regulation are in agreement that it's probably the number 2 factor beyond diet that determines our body weight, even more than exercise, which is really interesting. But it's not, of course, just about body weight. It's sleep deprivation affects every system of our body, and it's connected with every modern chronic disease that we know about. And it has it's particularly important for kids, and so we know that teenagers now are getting about 2 hours less sleep than they should be. We're starting to see a lot more attention on how electronic devices like smartphones are interfering with sleep and what the harmful effects of that are. So, with sleep, it's the number one. The first thing is just how much are you getting? How many hours are you spending in bed? For most people, that should be 7 to 8 hours. There's only a very small number of people who are outliers who can get by with a little less or who need a little bit more. But most people who think they're in that group aren't, and they're just fooling themselves, which is, again, unfortunate given how many things it's associated with. But it's not just staying in bed. Like if you're in bed for 7 to 8 hours, but you're sleeping with your phone next to your head and you're waking up at 2 a.m. because your phone is beeping and somebody just liked your picture on Instagram, that's going to have that's not quality sleep. That's going to lead to fragmented sleep, and it's going to cause problems. Even if you're not checking things throughout the night, just the small amount of light that's emitted from the phone is enough to interfere with melatonin production and cause a lot of health problems. And that's particularly true for kids because their retinas are much more sensitive to light than adults are. So that turns out there's a lot more to the sleep story than even just, getting the right amount of sleep. We have to make sure that we're getting high quality sleep and we're getting uninterrupted sleep. We're sleeping in a dark room. We're preferably sleeping in a cool room because we sleep better in a cool environment. That's also has there are evolutionary reasons for that. But I'd say it's the thing that even people who are pretty attentive to their diet and their physical activity often need the most work on because our culture is just going in the wrong direction as far as this goes, and it's not supportive of healthy sleep hygiene.
Right. This is one of the things that I've become non-negotiable on, and I've become the loser friend who doesn't eat dinner after 6 p.m. because otherwise my sleep routine will be off.
Do you have kids, Anthony?
No, I don't.
So that's your ticket, because when you have a 6-year-old like we do, I say, "Oh, sorry, got to get home because my daughter, she gets to bed early, so we got to go home and have dinner at 5:30." When she gets to be a teenager, I'm not going to have that excuse anymore. But I like having it now.
What about stress? I know you're a big meditator.
Yeah, I think stress. Yeah. We always had stress throughout history. I mean, I don't buy the argument that human beings didn't have stress when we were hunter-gatherers and everything was hunky-dory. Of course, we were worried about whether the next hunt would be successful and, where our next meal would come from. And there was tribal warfare and all of that. But generally, I think it's fair to say that the periods of stress and not stress were more demarcated. There was not as high of a level of stress in the background as there is now. And we live in a time where our fight or flight systems, which are really, specialized stress response, it's only supposed to be active in periods where we're, under threat and we have to either run away or fight to survive. That system is activated 24/7 for a lot of us in today's world. And I mentioned technology before. I really do think that is a big part of it. I'm increasingly concerned about the impacts of technology on our lives, and the stress component is really one of the biggest ones, because these are essentially interruption devices. And if you had to design a device that was guaranteed to make sure that we would never have any leisure or solitude or time just with our own thoughts, you would design a smartphone. And right. I think this is really causing a much higher level of stress for most people. And so, I'm increasingly turning my attention to, raising awareness about this and starting to, create some programming around how we can continue to use these devices. I'm not a Luddite. I use them myself, and they're, incredibly helpful and useful. But how can we use them responsibly in a way that doesn't impact our health in negatively?
Yeah. Number one is no notifications. And then two, I think what people can also do, which I'm doing. So I turn 30 in a couple of weeks. So big 3-0. And to more than that, I'm going to be going on a 7-day digital detox, which I know you're a fan of those as well. And like that can just reset a lot of these things where, just like nutrition, you can slip a little bit and not realize how reliant you've gotten on this technology. And so the first day or two on these little digital detoxes, which is just, I'm not going to go on the internet, I'm not going to go on my phone, I'm not going to go on my computer. They're actually really challenging. Like I feel an itch to check things and to do stuff. And it's just, that slips over time. And I think doing, once a quarter if you can, once every year, I think it can be so beneficial just to remind you as well.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things to that. I mean, we have a digital Sabbath on Sunday. So on Saturday night after dinner, we put all of our devices, phones, iPads, laptops, everything in a drawer. We shut them down. We turn off the Wi-Fi router, and for until Monday morning, we don't interact with technology at all. And I found we even. Like my daughter, we just did it last Sunday, and my daughter wanted to look up something on YouTube for her finger knitting project. And we just said no. It's like, you can figure it out. And guess what? She figured it out. It was kind of amazing to watch. It was like, wow. I mean, this is one example of what technology does. Is it interferes with what's called the default mode, which is a mental state that where that we get into when our minds are wander and we're not engaged in some kind of cognitive activity. And this is where creativity and imagination happen. So this digital Sabbath is like my favorite thing in the world now. I feel in some ways like I'm on a drug. It's that notable to have no exposure to technology at all for like a 36-hour period. It's really a revelation, and I wish that everyone could have that experience on a regular basis, because it's really transformative. And that so that's something that we've been doing that I think can be really helpful. And then I would say another big one is just you mentioned no notifications, but just to expand on that a little bit, like, no notification. For me, I just do no notifications except for text messages, because I have a kid, and sometimes that, I need to be available in case something comes up. But the phone is designed to, as I said, to interrupt us. Like, you have to remember that there is a team of thousands of engineers on the other side of your phone that their sole purpose is to steal your attention.
For every app.
Yeah. Because why? Because you are the product. You're not the customer. You're the product. So they want they sell your attention to their customers. That's how they make money. And so they have a whole team of neuroscientists who so explicit purpose in life is to steal as much of your attention as they possibly can. And one of my Zen teachers used to have this saying, which I really love: the focus of your attention determines the quality of your experience in life. So the more you give your attention, to these apps and these other things, first of all, you're making money for these other people. You may not be your goal, but the less control you have over the quality of your experience in life.
That's a good point. And then I think that we give people a lot to chew on before we wrap up. I just want to talk about another thing that, say if people want to start making those changes, if they're not already there, but if people are already at a point where they maybe have a chronic health condition that they need managed. Another stat you put in the book was that a patient visit is roughly 10 to 12 minutes on average. I was spending 45, 60 minutes visit with patients, which was leading for me 8 to 10 people a day. I did the math on this, and it's a couple thousand people a year, 50,000 people in my entire career. Like we can't have clinicians be doing that on like a very small scale. And so I think something that you're really encouraging is a collaborative health model. And so maybe you could just talk about that and just your ADAPT framework and your training. That I was actually, I think, the first class of the training. And I think that, you guys are just doing incredible stuff. And I think that this, from like an actual treatment standpoint, is something that's going to entirely change the game.
Well, thank you. And so I've had a kind of master plan for a while, and so we're working our way through it. But the first was to get clinicians that are trained in this functional medicine, ancestral diet, and lifestyle, which as you mentioned, you were in the first class, but we've had now 4 different cohorts go through that. But just as you pointed out, Anthony, that's not a sustainable model, a scalable, sustainable model that's going to be able to deal with the healthcare needs of 300 million people, in our country, much less the billions of people around the world. So if you think of health care as a pyramid, there's like a small percentage of people who need to be in the hospital because they're so sick, right? Maybe 5% or less, are in and out of that kind of more intense short-term acute care. Then you've got like another 25% that have, complex chronic illness and are going to need to be under the care of a functional medicine type of provider on a pretty regular basis. People with MS or, rheumatoid arthritis or conditions like that. But then you got 70% of people who, some of them might have a chronic disease, some might not, but their symptoms are milder and they're more under control. So you might have people who have IBS or GERD or things like that. And so my argument is that we need to structure the delivery of care in a way that reflects that pyramid. So, instead of sending those 70% of people right straight to the doctor, which, we don't have enough doctors and we never will, why not send them to a health coach who can work with them on their diet, their lifestyle, and their behavior, because we know those are the primary drivers of chronic disease, and let them work with that health coach first. And in many cases, that will be all that they need. Or at least it will dramatically reduce the number of visits that they would need to have with the doctor, and even the length of those visits, because they're going to be much more focused in the time that they have with the doctor, because they're already addressing all the diet, behavior, and lifestyle pieces with the health coach or nutritionist. So that's why we're launching. The next phase for us is to launch a health coach training program, because for the reason that I just mentioned, I think that we should have 10 or 20 health coaches for every single licensed practitioner there is.
Yeah,
right now it's backwards. It's upside down, and so then you have like a big foundational layer of these health coaches and nutritionists, and then we can do that model that you mentioned with longer visits with the doctor, and especially if you include another layer in between that is like nurse practitioners and physician assistants and group visits, where you group people who have a similar condition or similar needs, and you can do get 6 or 8 of them together in a room with the nurse practitioner and can get most of the stuff that you need to get done that you would have otherwise had to do one-on-one with the doctor. So if we get creative, there are a lot of different ways we can accomplish these goals.
Well, you guys are doing a hell of a job. Can you just let people know where they can find that and then maybe where to follow your work?
Sure. So the training is at kresserinstitute.com. And then my main website is at chriskresser.com. I also have a podcast called Revolution Health Radio that's on iTunes.
Awesome. Well, I know you got to go. But thanks, Chris, for being on the show. And like I said, keep up the good work.
Thanks, Anthony. You too. Take care.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. But even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.